All right, well, good morning, everyone. All right, this morning we're picking up on our study of Revelation, and it's called an Introduction to Revelation because our goal is not to go through as a commentary or an expository class where we go through every verse and try to explain what it means. Rather, we're looking at it a little bit higher level, understanding some of the themes and patterns that are in the book, some of the symbolism, and try to make sense of that. And last time we talked about the goals. So if you remember from last time, the goals are, number one, to give you a framework for reading the book of Revelation. So you can make sense and read it for yourself. And when you read it, the goal number two is to be encouraged and not frustrated. Number three was to embrace truth and avoid sensationalism. And number four was to understand different viewpoints and why do people have such strong differing opinions on this. So let's jump in right away. And what I have on the screen, let me read this quote. I think many of you will probably know immediately where this is from. Just as Christian and Pliable ended this talk, they drew near to a very miry swamp that was in the middle of the plain. And since they were both being careless, they fell suddenly into the bog. The name of the swamp or sloth was Hopelessness. Here, therefore, they wallowed for a time, being dreadfully smeared with the dirt. And Christian, because of the burden that was on his back, began to sink in the mire. And during this time, Pliable, you see the ellipses on the screen, so during this time, Pliable leaves because he's kind of just like frustrated, and why did I come along and get into this mess? So it picks up. Therefore, Christian was left to stumble in the slough of hopelessness alone. But still he endeavored to struggle to that side of the slough that was further from his own house, or the city of destruction, and next to the narrow gate, which he did, but he could not get out because of the burden that was on his back. But I beheld that a man came to help, whose name was Help. Now, I'm sure you know where this is from. Where is this from? Yeah, this is from the Pilgrim's Progress, the very famous book written by John Bunyan. And I would say, well, what does this passage actually mean? And I would say, was there actually a man named Christian and Pliable, and were they on a road, and did they fall into a slough of hopelessness or despondency? And did then a man come along named Help and offer help to the man? And of course you would say, no, that's not what it's talking about. And I would say, well, how do you know? How do you know that's not what happened? And you would say, well, because it's the genre. This is Christian allegory. This is not supposed to be taken as historical narrative. This is Christian allegory, and therefore all the things as you read it are allegorical. All the people and places represent something else, and there are symbols and visions to teach those things. And so, and I would say to that, you're right. It is Christian allegory, and because it's Christian allegory, because that's the genre, you're right. That's how we're to interpret the Pilgrim's Progress. And what I'm telling you is that when we read the book of Revelation, we need to understand the genre. There are all kinds of different genre used in the Bible. So there's historical narrative. When you read the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, for instance, you are reading a historical narrative, a historical account of what actually took place. When you read the Psalms or other wisdom literature, that is its own genre. Or when you read an epistle, that is a type of genre. It is a letter with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, and you must read it that way. And so when you want to understand the book of Revelation, you need to understand its genre. and its genre is what is called apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature. Now, Revelation, I quoted this last time from Dennis Johnson, Revelation seems resistant and unresponsive to the way of regular interpretation as applied to the other books of Scripture. It's neither historical narrative like 1 Samuel, nor an epistle like Romans, nor a collection of laws, songs, or wise aphorisms. And so when you try to interpret those passages, you interpret them with an understanding of the genre. So when you read the book of Revelation, you also need to know its genre and what are some of the characteristics. And so when you see those things, you can understand what it's talking about. So what is apocalyptic literature? What's some of the history of it? So apocalyptic literature is a form of literature that came about around the deportation, the time of the deportation of the Jews to Babylon. And it was a form of literature that was born out of troublous times. So the people are facing some big trial, maybe persecution of some sort, and the person who would write in this apocalyptic form, their goal was to encourage piety or stress virtue and loyalty, to stimulate faith in the people. And show like there might be all these huge dragons and monsters and things that seem so overpowering, just like the Babylon seems overpowering, but in the end God is victorious. And keep pressing on the good fight. In Ray Summers' book, Worthy as the Lamb, he details and goes through numerous different apocalyptic texts from the Old Testament times that are not from the Bible, but just from the Old Testament, that you can see, yes, this is a form of literature that had very hallmark characteristics. And what are those characteristics? Well, number one is it always seems to include these visions where someone is transported from one place to another, and the place they're transported allows them to see behind the scenes. And they get to see things as they really are. Not how you see them on the outside, but you get to go behind the veil and see what they look like as they really are. You see, in the book of Revelation, things are not what they seem. And so when we read the book of Revelation, we get to peer behind the curtain and see the way things they really are. And so there's these visions. Number two, there's symbolism. And so with symbolism, the idea is that ideas or principles or qualities are represented as concrete things. So just like in the Pilgrim's Progress, help, the person help was a physical representation of an idea or principle, help. And in the book of Revelation, those same sorts of things happen where the beast is symbolic of an idea or a principle, which might be physical persecution or governmental, state-sponsored persecution, for instance. You'll understand later why I say that. But this symbol, this thing, symbolizes an idea. And what you'll find out is in the book of Revelation that numbers do the very same things. Numbers are as symbolic as, a beast or something like that. And those numbers actually communicate ideas. And there's a lot of other things that we could talk about, but the last thing is that it's dramatic. It's vivid. The apocalyptic literature, it's vivid. It's memorable. It's got these strange and grotesque things like a river of blood, a hideous beast, a harlot in gold, stars falling from the sky, and mountains being moved. And those are the hallmarks of apocalyptic literature. And when you read the book of Revelation, you say, that's exactly what I see. I see a troubled and persecuted people needing encouragement. I see John using visions and being transported behind the scenes to see things as they really are. I see these symbols being used to communicate ideas, and it's all done in this very dramatic form. And this is what Ray Summers says. Let me read this quote. The book, like other apocalypses, shows that even though sinners may seem to be temporarily triumphant, the righteous are admonished to persist in piety, knowing that God in his own good time will come to their assistance, bestow upon them a glorious reward, and mete out terrible punishments to their enemies. I mean, that is the book of Revelation in one sentence. It's to see that though there are these temporary trials and creatures and beasts that seem so triumphant, it's only for a time. And you are to be admonished to piety, knowing that God in his good time will come to your assistance, bestow upon you a glorious reward, and mete out terrible punishment on your enemies. And he says, he goes on to say, for the deepest appreciation and clearest understanding of Revelation, we must keep this in mind. When people were being killed and exiled and robbed of all their property for refusal to renounce their religion, when evils were threatening to strike a death blow within the church, is there any hope for the future? And that would have been a question that people would have been asking. And Ray Summers says, Revelation is God's answer to that question. All right, so I'm going to skip the last quote. So that's the genre. It's apocalyptic literature. It has these hallmark characteristics. Now, for the rest of the time we have, I want to talk about different approaches to the book of Revelation. So if you have your outline in your notes, this is on page 2. And you see the genre of apocalyptic literature on top. And there was a space for you to take some notes. We're going to skip the section that talks about numbers as symbols, and we're going to come back to that in a few weeks, because that's another characteristic of apocalyptic literature, is numbers being symbolic. And we'll talk about those numbers. But for today, what I want to look at is that bottom section, approaches to Revelation. Approaches to Revelation. And what I want to do is help you understand. One of our goals was to understand different viewpoints. And what I want to help you understand this morning is, how do people come to such radically different conclusions when they read the book of Revelation? I mean, how can someone end up in a place where they think that this is talking about some Russian aggression in the Middle East, in some Middle East conflict, and there's these Apache helicopters and things? How could you have that? And then to the other extreme, where people believe this was all fulfilled in the first century, and it was talking about the nation, or the Empire of Rome, and Christian persecution and all that. And what I would say to that is, it comes down to your assumptions. And particularly what we're going to talk about, and there's probably more, but 3 fundamental assumptions that people make, or 3 answers to 3 questions that I'm going to ask. And how you answer those questions, the approach you take, the assumptions that you make will determine where you end up. So if you, for instance, say, well, let me say what the questions are. Are these events in the book of Revelation, are these literal or are they figurative? Should we take these things literally or symbolically? Okay? How you answer that question will determine how you interpret the book or where you end up. Question number 2, is this primarily talking about past events or future events? Is it talking about specific things? And are those things past or future? And how you answer that will determine how you interpret the book. And do these events occur in the chronology of the book? Or is there some sort of cycle or circular or repetition that's going on? And what I'm saying is, how you answer those 3 questions will determine how you end up interpreting this book. And so if you say this is literal, it's talking about future events, and the chronology of the book is the chronology that the way things will play out, you will end up over here. And another person would say, no, this is primarily talking about past events. It's generally symbolic, and there's some amount of recapitulation or iteration happening, and I'll explain what that means. Well, if you take that approach, you'll end up somewhere completely different. So understanding what those assumptions people make and why they make them will help you understand why people come to just radically different conclusions about what this book means. And it'll help us evaluate those assumptions and see which are the better assumptions and which ones aren't so good. But let me say this, as we go through this, there are godly people I admire, who take a different approach than I do. And that's okay. That doesn't mean I'm smarter than them. It doesn't mean I'm more godly than them. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means I took different assumptions about the book, and I think my assumptions are better. I think my assumptions are more biblically based. But that does not mean that they're, just ungodly people or something like that. It just means we disagree, and it's okay. Let's work through those disagreements. All right, number one. Is this literal? Are these literal things that are going to happen, or is there some amount of symbolism? And so let me read this. Revelation chapter 9. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power, like the power of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. And you would say, well, we have to take this literally, that there will literally be scorpion or locusts that come from the earth and attack people and all that. And where possible, we must be literal. But you press on them and say, well, but keep reading. Verse 7, in appearance the locusts were like horses prepared for battle on their heads, and they were crowned with crowns of gold, and their faces were like human faces, and hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth, and they had breastplates like iron, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses and rushing into battle. They have tails and stings like scorpions, and the power to hurt people for 5 months is in their tails. And they have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek is called Apollyon. And so you would say, well, do you really think that these locusts will have crowns on their head and have human faces and hair like women's and teeth? And they'll say, well, probably not. And you even ask these people, and they'll say, this is actually describing a helicopter in the Middle East, and that's what this locust flying thing is. And he was just trying to explain it as best as he could in his. And I would say, well, you're not being literal anymore. That's not literally what it says. You're taking it symbolically. So this idea that you should take it literally when possible is kind of difficult, because the whole book is written like this. This whole book is kind of written in this strange language and symbolic. And so you press people and they say, well, yes, yeah, and I even said they would interpret these as symbols. This represents something else. But they would say, what you can take literally, for instance, is like the fact that this event happens for 3.5 years, or the physical dimensions of something being 1,200 stadia, which is equivalent to like 1,500 miles, or those measurements we can take literally. But even that is suspect, because as I mentioned, numbers are symbolic in the book of Revelation. And you want to be careful, and even the NASB, if you go to chapter 21, the NASB would take these numbers and translate them into American imperial equivalents. So instead of translating the city of Jerusalem being 12,000 stadia, they translated it into English as 1,500 miles. And the problem with that, the problem with translating into English units, well, number one is it's not literal. Number two, it completely loses any value because it's not the size that's important, it's the number that's important. It's 12,000 stadia, not 13,000, not 11,000, it's 12,000 stadia. And that number is important. So the NASB, I think, realized this mistake, and in their latest update, the 2020, they reverted back to the literal Greek numbers of 12,000 and so on and so forth, because those numbers have meaning, and you lose that meaning when you translate it in English. So is this talking about literal events or symbolic? I would say almost everybody says it's symbolic events. It's just to what extent are they symbolic? What are they symbolic of? And for instance, are numbers symbolic, or are those numbers to be taken literally? Something's literally going to be 3.5 years. That's a question. And, if you make an assumption that you should take those numbers literally, it's one way. And if you say even the numbers themselves are symbolic, you're going to end up with a different a different interpretation. Number two, are these events mostly, what are the order of these events? I'm going to actually change the order here. Are the order of events that happen in the book of Revelation the order in which they're written in the book? And this is kind of a strange concept. So let me just put this slide up on the screen. There are two viewpoints. One is that the book of Revelation happens, it's written in the order in which the events will happen. So, pretty easy to understand. Chapter 4 happens before chapter 5 in time, in chronology. And chapter 11 happens before chapter 12. Chapter 13 happens before chapter 14, so on and so forth. That it's written in order of the way things happen. Now, the problem with that is that leads to some problems. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it leads to problems that are really hard to interpret, that make people take a different viewpoint. So, for instance, one of those problems is, well, clearly they would say chapter 6 happens before chapter 7, and chapter 6 happens before everything that comes later in the book. But read the end of chapter 6. Read what it says. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Listen to that. The sky vanished like a scroll being rolled up. When you read that, what do you think? The sky being rolled up like a scroll, that comes out of the Old Testament. That's talking about the end of the world. Every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks and the mountains, calling to the mountains, and this is also coming from the Old Testament, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. Who can stand? Who can stand? Who could stand before the wrath of God that's being poured out? And these people are so frightened that they're hiding in the mountains. And meanwhile, the mountains are being removed and thrown, removed from the place. Islands are being removed. The sky is being rolled up. The people are calling out, and you're like, my goodness, this is the end of the world. How does anything happen after this? Because you keep reading, and it's almost like this never happened when you keep reading. Because suddenly, the people aren't scared anymore. And suddenly the mountains are back to where they were, and the sky seems perfectly normal. And what's happening? And if you're just traditionally saying these events happen in chronological order, you have to answer that question. What happened? What is happening here? Because this seems, if you read the Old Testament, these are images coming straight out of the Old Testament talking about the end of the world. How does anything survive this? How does anything happen after this? And that's not the only time this happens. There are other cataclysmic events that happen. Let me take another, before I go on to those, let me take a step back. Chapter 12 is describing, it seems, to be the birth of Christ. So you have to at least say chapter 12 happens before chapter 6, at least, because it's talking about the birth of Christ. So at least there's some amount of not sequential ordering of events. But there are other cataclysmic events that happen too, and one of them is in chapter 14. Chapter 14 says, "Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he had a sharp sickle," and it's describing this harvest of the earth, which Jesus talks about angels harvesting the grain or the wheat and the tares. And this seems to be analogous to that there's this reaping that's happening and a judgment. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who had authority over the fire. He called out with a loud voice to the one who had a sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle across the earth, and he gathered a grape harvest of the earth. And listen to this. He threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. Like 150 miles. How does anything happen after that? Who didn't? Who wasn't thrown into the winepress of the wrath of God? Because it says these angels took a sharp sickle, and it was over the entire, it seems to be over the, verse 19 says, across the earth, the whole earth. Who wasn't a part of this? And being trampled in the great winepress of God's wrath and blood flowing everywhere. Who survived that? How does a chapter 17 or chapter 15 happen after this? How does it just seem to go back to normal in chapter 15? And so if you just hold that these events happen sequentially, it seems to be that you have questions to answer. And so that has led people to say, these events are not happening sequentially. And they hold to a different view called recapitulation or iteration, which says these events are not necessarily sequential. And some of these events may even span the entire church age. And so the word recapitulation, if you see it on the screen, that means an act of summarizing or restating the main points of something. And so the recapitulation theory holds that Revelation is not one long sequential list of events. Rather, each iteration or recapitulation is providing a second or third camera angle on the same historical event. Or it might be talking about similar historical events, different historical events that share a common pattern. So if you look at the screen here, each box represents a chapter. So chapters 4, 5, and 6 seem to be sequential in order. But chapter 6 seems to span the entire church age, from the time John wrote until the very end, because the end of chapter 6 seems to be the end of the world. The sky being rolled up, people hiding in the mountains and wanting to die because God's wrath has come. And so chapter 7 is an interlude. Chapter 8, 9, 10, and 11 which is talking about the 7 trumpets, seems to be that same time period, spanning from John's time to the end of the world. The 7 trumpets seem to be covering that same time frame as chapter 6, but from a different angle, talking about different things, focusing on different ideas. Chapters 12, 13, and 14 are the same. It seems to be another iteration or recapitulation of telling the same story from a different angle, from a different point of view. And so it's resetting the clock, going back and retelling the story from chapter 12 as the beginning of the church age through chapter 14, which seems to be, that's the God's wrath, the winepress of God's wrath, and no one can survive that. So chapters 15 and 16, that seems to be another iteration, but this time, chapters 15 and 16 don't seem to go all the way back to the beginning of the church age, but focus in, zero in, get closer, like a closer perspective on what the end of the world looks like. Chapter 17 and 18, talking about the downfall of the harlot Babylon, seems to be the same thing, starting over and looking at the downfall of the woman Babylon. And then chapters 19 and 20 also seem to be, 19 seems to be another iteration. Chapter 20 seems to be another iteration, talking about the downfall of the 2 beasts or the dragon. So what they would say is that the events of chapter 6, which describe the end of the world, is the end of the world. And when you pick up in chapter 7 and 8, it's resetting the story and telling it from a different angle. It's like when you watch the Packers play football, and there's a controversial play. We don't know if it was a touchdown or not, and the ref goes under the hood to look at this play and try to make a decision about what happened. And so what he does is he looks at the play in real time, and he doesn't get quite a good understanding. He gets an overview of what happened, but then he looks at the same play from a different camera angle, and he might slow it down or speed it up so he gets a different perspective of what happened on that play. And then he maybe comes in a third play, and rather than watching the whole play, he zooms in on just the few seconds to see where was the ball and where were the guy's feet at that time. And he patches this all together, and he gets 5, 6, 7 different camera angles, some spanning the whole play, some just a few seconds at the latter part, and he finally sees it all together, and he makes his judgment: touchdown, Packers. 2 feet were in, ball was under control, touchdown, Packers. Okay, so that is what the recapitulation theory would hold, is that these events are not sequential. These events are being retold multiple times from different camera angles to give you a better understanding of what is actually happening in the spiritual warfare that's happening. That is recapitulation. And last, the last question is this primarily talking about future events or past events, or anything at all? And what I would do is, I have this chart up here, which is just 4 quadrants. And the axes don't mean anything. It's just trying to say, if you had these 4 quadrants, that you could generally label these quadrants as preterism, historicism, futurism, and idealism. There's these four camps that you can fall into. Is this talking about future events or past events? And there's some continuum here. And each has its own strengths and weaknesses. So let's look at it. Historicism would say, they would say, when you read the book of Revelation, you are to read it in a sequential order. So chapter 6 happens, and then chapter 7, those events described in chronological time happen later, and so on and so forth. And they would say, and even beyond that, those events describe actual specific events in time that will happen, and we can put a name on it. And there's a one-to-one correlation between the symbol and some fulfillment about it at time. And what they would say is, the thing about historicism is, what they would say is that the book of Revelation is not confined to just the end of the world or the first century. It's describing the entire church age from the time Christ came to the time he's coming back. And each of those events describes some epochal change in the world. So, for instance, they would say chapter 6 is describing the downfall of the Roman Empire. Chapter 7 is describing the spread of Christianity across the world. Chapter 8 would describe about 500 AD, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And Revelation 9 is talking about the rise of Islam in the 7th century. And chapter 10 is maybe talking about the Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s. And chapter 11 is about the French Revolution. And so what they're trying to do is say, yes, these things happen in order, and they're describing these huge monumental shifts in the history of the world, and we can read Revelation to understand those huge shifts. And so, who would hold to this? Not many people today, but a lot of the reformers did. It's my understanding that Martin Luther was more of a historicist and read the book of Revelation this way. From my understanding, Jonathan Edwards, who was not necessarily a reformer, but in the American revival, he believed he was living between the sixth and seventh trumpet or seals or something like that. But you won't find many people who hold this viewpoint today. But I add it there just so you can understand that viewpoint. Futurism is the next big one, and I think most people are familiar with this. A futurist would tend to concur with a historicist in their desire to interpret the visions by identifying them with very specific historical events or institutions or individuals. And while they may view some amount of recapitulation in the text, chapter 12 being the most obvious, they would say for the most part these things are happening in sequential order. Now, where futurism parts with historicism is that they would say chapters 4 to 19 in Revelation do not describe the entire church age from the time Christ came to the time Christ came back. Primarily what it's talking about is these future events that only those last generation of Christians, that last 7 years, it's only talking, the event is only talking about those events. That final generation before Christ comes back, or maybe 1,007 years. And they would say this is primarily talking about all future events. Everything in Revelation that happens after chapter 3 is not only future to the original reader, it's future to us, it's future to every person who walks this earth until that last generation. Preterism comes from the Latin word past, would say just the opposite. This is not talking about future events, distant future events for the first century. What they would say is, this is talking about the first century Christians. They were facing tribulation and trial. They needed encouragement. They were facing the beast of Rome. They were facing the second beast that was pressing upon. It was the cult of the emperor worship, and pressing Christians to give in and worship the emperor as Lord. That's what it's talking about. It's all these symbols were actually things that happened in the first century, and this book was about them and about how the Christians were to press on. And it's all in the past. And in some ways it's very compelling because it makes sense, and a lot of the things they say make sense. But hardly anyone would hold to preterism fully, which is why I call it full preterism. They would hold to something like partial preterism, because most preterists today would say, yes, there are some things that are future. Primarily, chapters 20 to 22. Primarily, obviously, 21 to 22, because that is talking about the eternal state, the heavenly Jerusalem coming down, the new heavens and the new earth. And so that's future, and maybe even chapter 20 is future, the destruction of the beast or the dragon and all those sorts of things. But everything else was past. At least chapters 4 to 19, maybe even 20, past is what they would say. All right, so the last viewpoint, and by the way, they take this verse and these series of verses very seriously. Chapter 1, verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants the things that must soon take place. Not the things that will take place in the distant future, but the things that must soon take place. And they take that very seriously. And they would say not only is in that chapter 1, but that's in chapter 22. Look at all these references. Chapter 22, verse 6, he says the same thing. These words are trustworthy and true, and the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. And then he says in verse 7, behold, I'm coming soon. And he repeats that in verse 12, I'm coming soon. Verse 20, I'm coming soon. Soon, 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 soon. Not 2,000 years from now, not 3,000 years from now, not 100 years from now. Now, soon. And so that's why they would justify that position. Idealism is kind of like all of them, but different from all of them. Again, the question is this mostly talking about past events, preterists, or is it talking mostly about future events, futurists, or is it talking about something else? And is it we expect there to be specific institutions or specific things to fulfill these chapters? And idealism comes along and says, maybe this is talking about specific events, but not really. What an idealist would say is, Revelation may refer to specific events, but what it's really after is it's encapsulating the struggle that every generation of Christians will have. Every Christian has to face the beast. Every Christian has to face the second beast. Every Christian has to face the harlot Babylon. It's not talking solely about the first century, nor is it solely talking about future events and what the last generation of Christians will face. The idealist says this is applicable and helpful and encouraging to all Christians because all Christians will endure these things. So idealism doesn't rest its interpretation on specific visions or specific features being linked with some specific historical event. They would agree with historicists that the visions symbolize the conditions confronting the church through the entire church age. It's not just past or future, it's all time. They would disagree with historicists trying to identify specific events. They would agree with preterists that this book was written to encourage first century Christians about things they were experiencing, that they had to endure. Yes, that's what it's written about. But at the same time, they would agree with futurists and say, yes, it's about what the future church will have to endure, the things that they have to go through. But that's not all. It's also written to you and to me, our church, and the things that we have to go through and the trials and tribulations that our church, I don't mean RBF, I mean the church universal, our brothers and sisters in China facing physical persecution, the church in America who is so tied up with money and being deceived by things like the prosperity gospel. And the church, our church at RBF, maybe we struggle with things like affluence and wanting to bend to the culture's demands so that we don't have to have a hard life. And so that they would say that the book of Revelation is talking about all of those things, past, present, and future. And so let me put up this slide to help you bucket it. And again, write these things down in your notes in that section called approaches. So the preterist is saying this is mostly written about past events, things that happened in the first century, and everything needs to be interpreted in light of that. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. Futurists is mostly future events. Historicists say this is just the outplaying of history. And an idealist would say, yeah, it's not really written about any one specific event, rather it's encapsulating the struggle of every generation. So let's see how this plays out. And how it actually plays out. So turn to Revelation chapter 11. Chapter 11 describes this beast. And then we read about him in chapter 13. In chapter 13, this is something that happens in the book of Revelation where we're told about someone and his destruction, the things that the people he endures or persecutes. He kills these two witnesses. We don't even know who this beast is. He's not even introduced to chapter 13, where we're said, oh, this is who he is. This is where he comes from. So that's one of the themes in the book of Revelation is we sort of get this taste of something and then we're fully introduced to it later. So chapters 11 and 13 describe this beast. And he's got all of these marks. And next week we'll talk about how understanding the Old Testament can help you understand what this beast actually is. And just for today, I'm going to make the assumption that you agree with this, that it is talking about, it is drawing symbolism from the book of Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, there's these 4 beasts that are like a lion, leopard, a bear, and this other creature that has 10 horns. And those beasts represent, each one of those beasts represents some governmental power or institution. So the first one would be Babylon. The second beast would be Assyria. Not Assyria, the Medo-Persian Empire. The third beast would represent Greece and Alexander the Great and his conquests. And the fourth beast was powerful, and more powerful than the rest of them. And that was the Empire of Rome. And it was malicious and devastating to Christians. And so the difference, though, in the book of Revelation is that it's not 4 beasts. This beast is one beast, and he's a conglomeration of all 4 of those beasts from Daniel. So almost everyone would interpret that beast as being some governmental, state-sponsored persecution of some sort. So let's just say you agree with that, and you would say, yeah, that's what this is talking about. I understand it from the Old Testament. I'll try to show you that next week. But anyway, assume that you agree with that. A preterist would look at that and say, what this is talking about, what this beast in chapter 11 and 13 is talking about is Rome. It's Rome. That's what Daniel was saying. It's the fourth beast from Daniel's vision. And so this is either talking about Rome, or maybe it's talking about Nero, or maybe it's talking about Domitian, who was a later emperor. And he was apparently not very friendly to Christians, and people said he was Nero Redivivus, which is like Nero reincarnated. And so that's what a preterist would say, is that's what the beast is referring to, Rome, Nero, or Domitian. That's specific. It's specifically Rome, or it's specifically Nero, or something like that. A futurist would say, no, it's not past Rome. It's actually the revival of the future Roman Empire, and maybe it's working in conjunction with the European Union and Russia or some other soon-to-arise one-world alliance. That's what it's talking about. It's specifically that thing. That's what this beast is. And a historicist might say, no, the beast is, yes, it's some kind of thing that rises and persecutes the church, but we think that's the rise of Islam, or maybe the French Revolution, or something like that. But still, a very specific event. And an idealist would say, no. Yes, but no. Because, yes, the vision is of these 4 beasts from Daniel, but it's a conglomeration. And what that's telling us is that it's not exclusively talking about Rome, but it's sort of this conglomeration that kind of represents any oppressive world power or agent of Satan in any generation to persecute Christians and try to have them to raise up something other than Christ in their hearts. And so it's not talking about any one particular thing. It's talking about the struggles that all Christians have. All Christians, every generation has to face the beast or the second beast, which seems to be religious corruption. So that's how they would interpret the beast. All right, so I skipped these other ones. I'm gonna just skip these for now because it's an oversimplification. But if I were to break this down, so here's these four quadrants: preterism, past; futurism, future. So they're kind of opposites on the graph. Historicism and idealism. And the point I want to make with this slide, what I'm trying to communicate is there's really a latitude. So each one of these bubbles is like a brain, meaning someone's interpretation or their thinking on this topic. So what this is saying is there's really latitude in each one of these groups. You may be a preterist, but some of your thinking lies closer to an idealist. Or you may be a futurist that sees a lot of recapitulation, and therefore you're kind of sympathetic to the idealist standpoint. And if you were to preach on this, maybe you would kind of preach futurism, but intermingle that with idealist thoughts and make it more applicable to us today. But again, even this graph is an oversimplification. All right, so let me reiterate. What we're talking about is how do you approach the book of Revelation? And depending on the assumptions you make, the answers you make to these three questions, and there's probably a lot more, will really drive where you end up. Is this are we to interpret these symbols literally or symbolically? Are these things literally going to happen, symbolically going to happen? Are the numbers literal or are they symbolic? Is this mostly talking about past events, or is this mostly talking about future events? Is it talking about specific events, or is it being generalized? And is the order that the events happen in the chronology that they play, the way that they're listed in Revelation, is that the chronology that they'll play out, or is there some form of recapitulation and retelling the story from multiple viewpoints? And what I'm saying is, the assumptions that you make will determine where you end up and how you approach the book and how you interpret the book. So when you're talking to someone you disagree with, before you get into an argument with them, you'll say, oh, interesting. So this person, as they're talking, I understand that they're a preterist. And I understand why they're coming at it from that viewpoint, and it actually makes a lot of sense. I may disagree with parts of it, but at least there's some assumptions that I understand that they're making that helps me make sense of their position. Or a futurist, you're talking to a futurist or an idealist, and you say, I understand where you're coming from. I may not agree with it, but I understand because you've made these assumptions and you approach the book this way, of course you're going to end up in this interpretation, or at least this ballpark of interpretation. You might be in right field because that's where your assumptions led you. And a preterist might end up in left field because that's where their assumptions led them. So to understand these viewpoints, why is there such strong disagreement? Well, I like to use this analogy. If you're walking in a straight line and you veer from that straight line, from straight ahead, just 1 degree, you may not think that's a big difference. But as you go and you keep walking 1 degree off from true north, you'll end up, and you go on for hundreds of miles, you'll end up hundreds of miles away from someone else just because you're 1 degree off. And what I'm saying is when you come to the book of Revelation and you just have slightly different assumptions of what it's talking about, you can come to wildly different conclusions. And that doesn't mean someone is mean or ungodly because they do that. It's just different assumptions. We need to talk about what are the better assumptions so we can come to the best conclusions. All right, let's end there.